Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, explore what makes arguably the most enigmatic of Haworth's famous literary siblings, Emily Brontë, such an attractive subject for filmmakers and biographers. Recorded live at the 2023 Bradford Literature Festival, Brontë expert Dr. Claire O'Callaghan, author of Emily Brontë Reappraised, and award-winning author and lecturer Michael Stewart lead a discussion of Emily Bronte's legacy, her relationship with her sisters, and whether she really was the wild child of the moors.
I am very much now an Emily person, and there is nothing more I would want than to speak to two of the foremost experts on Emily Brontë. So I feel very lucky, and we're all very lucky. So let me introduce first Claire O'Callaghan, who is an academic and a Brontë scholar, and has written Emily Brontë Reappraised, A View from the 21st Century. Claire is a lecturer at Loughborough University, but actually lives in Haworth on purpose, so we'll talk a bit more about that. And is newly co-editor of the Brontë Studies Journal. Her recent research has challenged views of Emily in all sorts of ways, and she's recently written a paper on the view of Emily as a stubborn, consumptive patient who was silly to refuse medical help, challenging that view. And we've also got Michael Stewart, who was not destined for a life of letters, leaving a failing comprehensive at 16, working in a factory, but has since become a super successful writer and associate professor of creative writing, which is quite a journey. His debut novel, King Crow, won the Guardian's Not the Booker Award. His latest poetry collection, The Dogs, is published today, this very day, and has been described by Steve Ely as doing for dogs what Ted Hughes did for crows. Like, that's the best promo line ever. we probably won't get to talk about... Oh, we will get to talk about dogs, because we'll talk about Keeper, actually, Emily's dog. So we'll have a dog section. Yes. And he made the Brontë Stones walking trail happen. So some of you will have done that, some of you will have been on that with him, and then he wrote a kind of memoir about that trail called To Walk Invisible in the Footsteps of the Brontes, and mainly seems to spend a lot of time in very bad weather on the moors now as a consequence of that.
We're going to walk tomorrow, in fact.
I gather. Yeah. Well, the weather's looking quite good, isn't it?
So far.
Yeah, so far. So I just want to ask you, first of all, both of you, Claire first, what was your first encounter with Emily?
So I'll precede that by saying my first encounter with Emily came after my first encounter with Charlotte. So a classic teen story. My dad used to take me to the library all the time. I was a real nerdy book kind of kid, and read Jane Eyre, loved Jane Eyre. And of course everyone says, well, then you read Wuthering Heights. So off went back to the library, got Wuthering Heights, and I was kind of reading it going, this is not Jane Eyre at all. So my first encounter is reading Wuthering Heights. I found it a really difficult book. I found it a very violent book. I was shocked by it. And I was fascinated by it at the same time because I kept mulling it over in my mind. And I wanted then to know more about Emily as a person. So I was nerdy in terms of reading biographies as a kid. I don't know why. I just really, from a really young age, loved biographies of writers and actors and all kinds of things. So then started working through those. But I felt it took me many years, and I kept rereading Wuthering Heights and kept going back to it to kind of get it. So my first encounter was a complicated one. I loved it, I hated it, but I was more than anything fascinated and overwhelmed by it, kind of at the same time.
And I should have mentioned in your intro, sorry Michael, you've also written The Missing Years of Heathcliff, Ill Will as a novel, so we'll talk about that too. But yeah, what was your first encounter with Emily?
Well, it's almost embarrassing to admit, really, but when Kate Bush's debut single, Wuthering Heights, reached #1 in February 1978, I was obsessed by the song, and I'd just received as a birthday present a cassette recorder. So I recorded this illegally off the radio many, many times. I filled the C60 cassette with this song. And my mother, I guess, looked on with some concern, really, you know. My mother had left school at 15, hadn't done her O-levels. She was very self-conscious about that. So she was going to night school, doing her English O-level. And she was studying Wuthering Heights, and she explained, well, she gave me a kind of, you know, a summary of the story. And I guess I just became fascinated then, at the age of, what age would I have been, 7. But I didn't read the book for many, many years after that. I think I picked it off the shelf and thought, not ready for this yet, you know. So I watched the film with my mother, you know, a year or two after. This is the 1939 MGM, Merle Oberon and Laurence Olivier, which differs quite a lot from the novel. But we watched it and enjoyed it, you know, and it was something we did. You know, my dad was always at the pub, so me and my mum would get some toast and a cup of tea, and we watched the Saturday afternoon film, so we watched that together. And then it was some years after that, when I was maybe 17, 18, one of my first girlfriends was into Wuthering Heights. And to impress her, basically, I read the book all the way through. And I just found it a really interesting book. But I wasn't obsessed at this stage. You know, I just thought it was an interesting book. And then I moved to Thornton in 2000, and I lived opposite the birthplace, more or less opposite the birthplace. And I became fascinated then by them as people, not just as writers. The house I was living in would have been there while they were children. They would possibly have played outside. So I just began thinking about them as human beings and became fascinated by them as writers and people. And that's really when I guess I became a Brontë obsessive around that time.
And because I'm feeling aware that the title of the panel is Understanding Emily, but I feel like what there is a lot of misunderstanding of Emily. So I suppose I would want to ask you next both, maybe to just, what is the misunderstanding that most gets on your wig?
God, where do we start? I mean, there are so many myths about Emily Brontë, and I think misunderstandings. And partly the reason for that, as we know, is, you know, when she dies, not, you know, within a year of publishing her novel, Charlotte is left facing the critics at the time, who were savaging Ellis Bell, you know, her pseudonym, and she constructed a biography that set all of the myths really in trail. You know, this idea that she was just this woman that didn't speak to people ever, and kind of both was fiercely intelligent but also didn't know what she was doing, and that kind of stuff. So there's a million myths that really bug me. I think the one I've been kind of working a lot with lately is a lot of the stuff around Emily's death, and I think you kind of alluded to that. So, you know, Wuthering Heights comes out in 1847 in the December, and she dies by the next December. She begins showing symptoms of tuberculosis in October, and that year, as I'm sure, you know, Brontë people know, Brother Bramwell dies in the September, and Emily soon after. And there's so many myths about that in terms of some biographers and critics have said she didn't know she was ill. Other people said she knew she was ill. She just was very silly and didn't do anything about it. If she'd gone and seen a doctor, she could have been cured. You know, she ignored her illness until it was too late. And actually, a lot of that is really a misunderstanding of tuberculosis, and the fact that by the time she was showing symptoms, it was already too late, and she couldn't have been cured from it. They didn't even understand what caused it at the time, so let alone curing it. The reason that bugs me is because these ideas of her being stubborn and silly and not wanting to see a doctor really kind of overlook the fact that this was a young woman, a 30-year-old woman who was dealing with her own mortality. Tuberculosis was a killer. She would have known that. She wasn't, you know, we talk about a bit of genius, you know, on the one hand, but we don't really afford her any compassion then in thinking, what on earth must that have been like, knowing that her brother's just died and their family's going to have to face that. That really annoys me, that kind of, she was stubborn, she was silly, it was too late. I just think people, you know, to think through what that must have been like for a young woman at that time must have been terrible. So that really bugs me, that people aren't just more compassionate about the whole thing.
I'd go with that, certainly. But yeah, I mean, there's lots and lots of things that bug me, really. And it goes back to Charlotte, as Claire said. Charlotte's the first one to kind of mythologise her sister. What did she say? She's this simple, creature, you know, just sort of a kind of primitive wanderer, you know, as a way of apologising for Wuthering Heights. So she kind of sets the bar in a way. And Elizabeth Gaskell, of course, then takes that and runs with it. She never actually met Emily. Emily died by the time she was writing Charlotte's biography. So, you know, this idea of Emily being the strange one, you know.
Which is what she got called in the village, didn't she? They kind of did call it the strange one.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. And what's happened in recent years is this trend for retro diagnoses, which I really, really dislike. The idea that Emily has Asperger's, or she's autistic, or well, there's so many diagnostics, should we say. Yeah. So these retro diagnoses of her, labelling her in order to understand her strangeness, if you like, as if you can't just be eccentric or strange or just be you know what I mean? You have to have a label. And that strikes me as interesting because that's what we're fixated on now. It doesn't make sense to take that and place that 200 years ago because that's not how people thought. We didn't have labels then, you know. And it's such a recent thing, isn't it? But that's really caught on, and that really irritates me.
I mean, that's part of the kind of the wider history. I mean, I think the Brontes, as a family, they've been diagnosed with retrospectively, with just about everything throughout the ages. And Emily, as a figure, I mean, she's been diagnosed with everything. Various forms of mental ill health, neurodiversity, eating disorders, all kinds of things. The thing is, there's just no evidence for a lot of these things. The stuff about the anorexia often comes from people talking about her death. The fact that she was really, really thin and the funeral, the coffin was so thin. That's why it was called consumption, because it consumed you. And she was out walking all the time. You know, she was thin, she was muscular in that sense. But so, yeah, it's interesting that there is a trend, a constant trend, I think. But that's, I think, again, part of people trying to understand Emily. And if we can put a label on it, we feel like we might be able to understand.
It's too easy, though, in a way, isn't it? Just to say, well, the reason why someone behaves like this is because of this label, you know. And it's always about, it's not really about understanding Emily, it's about understanding us now, really, isn't it? And I think that's what happens as people interpret Emily over the last 200 years. Each attempt is really saying something about the current mores of that particular era.
Absolutely. And I kind of, so I would want to ask then, so there is this, even though there's a lot of misunderstanding of Emily or understanding that's going in all sorts of directions, why then is there this drive to understand her at all? Why are we so compelled? Is it extractable from the wider Brontë fascination? Is there something particular about Emily that compels now?
I think partly the reason for it is Emily is the Brontë we understand the least because she didn't leave very much, other than a body of poems and Wuthering Heights. There's very few letters, other than, you know, literally 2, and they're really perfunctory. She left some diary papers that she co-wrote with Anne, these little periodic things on her birthday. But we don't really have anything, other than the fiction, from Emily's voice about her. So she's a void. We got loads from Charlotte. In fact, Charlotte is always the key to understanding all the Brontes. And as Charlotte said about Emily, you know, an interpreter always has to stand between her and the world, or should stand between her and the world. So I think that void, that we don't have anything firsthand from Emily, means that she has to be interpreted by other people. And that's why we're trying to understand why we don't have anything, but also what was there. And so that's, I think, the driving force behind a lot of it.
Yeah, and I think there's also this thing where when you read Wuthering Heights, and when you read a poetry as well, but particularly Wuthering Heights, it's hard to square that with a clergyman's daughter, you know, who we understand didn't have a romantic relationship, you know. I mean, maybe she did, but as far as we understand. There are things there's very visceral descriptions of violence, and there's very sort of heartfelt emotions regarding love and so on. I guess it's that disparity and that schism, if you like, that makes us so fascinated by her. But I also think now, you know, you talked about Charlotte and Jane Eyre, and I think at one time perhaps Jane Eyre was the most well-known Brontë novel, but I think actually Wuthering Heights is kind of overtaking it. And I think that's because our tastes in literature have changed, and I think that novel has lasted perhaps in a way that some of the other Brontë novels haven't. You know, it doesn't suffer from and I'm sitting next to a Victorian literature expert, so I'm going to be careful what I say, that some Victorian novels have a kind of sentimentality, even a tweeness, maybe even a silliness. Some of the plot points in Jane Eyre, I mean, I love Jane Eyre, but, it gets a bit silly towards the end, doesn't it?
That's Charlotte told, isn't it?
And I don't think you can say that about Wuthering Heights. It's a hard, tough book, and it doesn't show any sentimentality, And I think we're ready for that now, in a way that maybe we weren't 100 years ago.
And does that partly, because, so we've had, for example, recently, the film Emily, which can I confess, as chair, I was trying to do my duty, and I was like, we'll watch the film Emily. But because I had felt I had now heard Emily speak through the poems, particularly, I was so appalled by the film, I had to turn it off after an hour. I was like, this is appalling. Sorry.
It does some very strange things, doesn't it? In the way it changes what we know of the history, Emily's story.
Yeah.
Some of them seem arbitrary. They don't seem to either develop the story or the character or have, attached to any sort of plot points. What most people don't realise about that film, and I've got lots of reservations about it as well, is because I've seen the script, Frances O'Connor's script, and the script has a card. The opening scene is a card, which is the quotation from Wuthering Heights, where Cathy is telling Nellie about the dream she has, the strange dream where her and Heathcliff are cast out of heaven. Yeah, and she talks about the water, the memories mingling like water and wine. Yeah, that's the opening of the script. In other words, it's a fever dream. It starts off with Emily on her deathbed, and it ends with her on her deathbed. And all that happens in that film is actually her fever dream. And that's missing from the produced film. They decided to take the card out. So you lose that context. And if you know that, it kind of makes sense of why the film doesn't make sense.
Yeah, yes.
Because it starts off with her having a book launch for a book called Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. Well, first of all, Father didn't know she'd written it. Her father was there at this launch party. There was no launch party. The book came out with Agnes Grey under the pseudonym Ellis Bell. and Charlotte's book had come out before. So that whole opening scene is completely, misconstrued. But if you see it as a fever dream, well, maybe it makes more sense.
Makes sense. And Claire, how was Emily for you?
Emily's been adapted on screen loads of times, but this is the first time it's a singular biopic about Emily, but she has appeared. There have been other Brontë biopics, and some of them are absolute madness, some of them are much more sane. This particular film, I think Frances O'Connor kind of indicated that she's a fan, but I don't think she's trying to claim any realism, and there's no realism. So I didn't approach it expecting it to be an authentic rendition of Emily Brontë, because it just isn't. So I could enjoy it on that level of not trying to see it and take it as reality. I thought I'm not a big fan of romantic films anyway, so that just bored me, quite frankly. And some of it was absolutely daft. I kind of found parts of it funny in that sense. I think if you can leave your Brontë brain to one side and just kind of let it wash over you, it's a brilliant soundtrack, brilliant costumes, beautiful scenery. Just the plot's a bit eccentric.
Yeah, and I think it's clever. I think to cast Emma Mackey as Emily Brontë was clever casting, because it opens it to an entirely new audience. But if you compare, that Emily with, let's say, the Emily in Sally Wainwright's To Walk Invisible, they couldn't be more different, could they? One's going around punching her sister in the face, and the one's giving, blowjobs and, getting tattoos and, So it's it's very interesting to see how differently the different portrayals of Emily. And then if you watch something like the Brontes of Haworth, the 80s ITV series, again, that's a completely different Emily. And then you go to Devotion, you go to that is an insane Emily. So you've got so many, and they can't all be Emily, can they? And
No.
Perhaps none of them are, in fact.
By definition. Although I feel, so the epigraph To Walk Invisible is from one of Emily Bronte's poems, which I think doesn't have a title but gets called Often Rebuked Yet Always Back Returning. And she says, and you quote this, "I'll walk where my own nature would be leading. It vexes me to choose another guide." And that felt to me maybe quite key to Emily. Was that why you chose that epigraph? And of course it's about walking and it's, you know...
Yeah, I mean, it's opposite in the sense that it's a walking quotation. But yeah, I think it nails, you know, certainly my understanding of Emily. You know, someone who's willful and independent and strong and books what's expected of a Victorian clergyman's daughter. In that sense of conformity, wants to be herself. And what we know of her is very little, but we know she largely stayed at home. You know, she went to Brussels, didn't like it. As soon as she had an excuse when her auntie died and she came back for the funeral, never went back again. She went to Law Hill in 1838, her only paid job. She was there for 6 months and came home. And she spent, you know, most of her time, a short life, at home, either baking or on the moors or reading or writing. So it seems she chose a very singular, independent path for herself, and that took a great deal of will and strength of character. I think that's the Emily that I understand.
What about you, Claire? How does that quote or that sense of Emily as independent sit?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that is a wonderful summary of Emily. When people say she's willful, I always hear a kind of... You can hear that as rebellious, but I think you can also hear it as like she's slightly problematic and not conforming to what other people want. I actually think she was just very comfortable being who she was. I think that, you know, you mentioned that she's at home a lot. I think she loved it. Haworth is a beautiful place. And again, this idea that she didn't, you know, like or want to speak to people, you know, she clearly liked being in the family home. If you read her diary papers, she's joshing with Tabby, the housekeeper. She's baking bread. She's teaching herself German. She is playing that wonderful piano. Again, we never talk about that Emily that's doing that, who's practicing all the scores, and she's so accomplished with that. I think she enjoys. So the independence that I hear is a woman who doesn't have any romantic relationships, doesn't want to get married, is enjoying just doing those things because she can. Because that is a freedom for her. But as you said as well, then she goes off walking on the moors. And again, for me, that idea, you know, in the 19th century, women walking on their own in spaces, you know, they wouldn't have been allowed in a city space. But in the moorland, in Yorkshire, off she's going for, you know, 20, 30 miles a day. That, for me, is a really powerful image. And I think it's a really, really beautiful one, actually.
So I think we should talk about walking, actually. And maybe, so you've moved to Haworth.
Like a geek, yeah.
How is it to be there and be so kind of immersed in the world of the Brontes, in particular, Emily, and you're right in that space?
So I had a change of life circumstances from COVID a few years ago that meant I basically could move and had could follow a different path in life. Obviously, as a Bronte scholar, and you know, I teach a lot of the Brontes. I'm up here in Haworth a lot anyway. You know, if I'm not in Wuthering Heights world or the Tenant of Wildfell Hall or Jane Eyre world, I'm here in Haworth. And so I feel like, you know, I was walking around with it in my hair, but I just thought, okay, I've got this opportunity. I can now live anywhere. Where would I want to live if I could live anywhere? And Haworth was that choice. So it felt to me like, and that of course then brings me closer to the Brontes. So there's a magic to it. And even still, every day, if I walk up that main street or I see the parsonage, there's an excitement that just doesn't go. It's like an infectious, contagious excitement that I just marvel and kind of think, she walked these streets, she was there, she was in that kitchen, these things. That excitement of kind of being like a tourist, literary tourist every day, it feels like a privilege to live there. And I do feel like it gives me more of a sense, particularly because, you know, walking a dog every day out there, I very often kind of think, God, she would have experienced these seasons and stuff like that. I mean, actually, probably the first reaction I had, because I just spent my first winter in Haworth, and one of the things it made me understand is, how did they walk on that main street and not break their leg every year? Because it's treacherous. I don't understand why there's not more, you know, more broken legs in the letters, in all of that material. So, yeah, it's a beautiful place.
And Michael, you've said you kind of feel like you can't understand the Brontes, really, unless you have walked those landscapes or been in those landscapes. And then that's partly why you started the brilliant Brontë Stones project, which means they are now memorialised across it's a 9-mile route, isn't it? But then there are other routes
Yeah,
too.
there are
Tell us
4
about that.
walks. There's one linear walk which connects Thornton to Haworth, and that's where the 4 stones are placed. And then there's a circular walk for each stone. Different lengths, so the Emily one's the longest, that's 15 miles. That goes across 5 moors that surround Haworth, so it's really giving you the Emily experience. The Charlotte walk starts in Thornton and is about 4 miles. That's quite a genteel, moderate walk. And then the Brontë is more kind of secluded. It's showing you a different side to Haworth, really. It's about 7 miles. So the idea was to match the walks with the personalities. And I worked with a cartographer called Chris Goddard, who a lot of people know because he's produced lots and lots of books, walking books, in this area. And, if you walk into a bookshop, you'll see a lot of his work. And so we walked together and we made these maps, basically. And the maps are not just maps, they also contain lots of information. Not just about the Brontes, about social history. But really, it came from when I was writing Ill Will, actually, because the way that I wrote that book was not how I'd written other books. I wasn't sat in my studio at my desk. I went onto the moors and I took a recording device and I dictated, if you like. And then I came back and recorded it. And I really liked that way of writing. One of the things I did is I walked to Liverpool, because in my book Ill Will, Heathcliff walks to Liverpool to find out who he is. He traces his roots. And I wanted to write that in character, if you like. So I did that walk over 3 days. It was quite an eventful walk. It wasn't a very pleasant walk, but it was quite an eventful walk. And I wrote that up as a kind of chapter of non-fiction. And as I was writing the book, I just thought, actually, the way that I'm approaching the Brontes now and the way that I'm understanding them is to immerse myself in the landscape. And I think it gives you a different dimension. Certainly in the case of Emily, but I think the others as well. So Walking the Invisible, the book, really was an attempt to immerse the reader in all that research, really. It starts in Thornton and each chapter moves out. And so you get to Liverpool on this side and Scarborough on that side. And then I walk home. So the idea is that each chapter is taking you further out. And it's a walking book, but it's also a hybrid memoir. So it's about my obsession about the Brontes as well, I guess.
And it's funny. I enjoyed it. I hadn't expected it to be funny. And that sends me on to something you kind of sort of mentioned a bit in passing in your book. And I was like, oh, yes. You say that Emily's sense of humour is underrated or under-noticed. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah. So if you read, I mentioned earlier that we don't have much by Emily in her own voice. And we commonly look and understand the Brontes through their letters. So if you go and you read the Brontë letters, you get all the little references to understanding them a little bit more. So we know, and of course some of the friends and the people that wrote about them who knew them well. So we know from, when they were children, Emily and Charlotte obviously had this playful, kind of tense sibling relationship, completely normal, siblings do. And yeah, she would tease Charlotte. Charlotte obviously was a bit scared of animals, which I'm terrified of animals on the moors. I'm still like, they're going to get me. And Emily would kind of leave Charlotte in places or lead her into places where Charlotte would then be like, oh, God, I don't want to be here. So we know that she kind of did that. We know that they were playful and mucking about and joking when they were creating their Gondor worlds, their imaginary worlds. They would play out these wonderful little dramas and sagas. And again, they're full of dark war and imprisonment, but there's also humour in those as well. So yeah, we don't really talk about the kind of that side of her. But then I think it doesn't fit with the myth that is constructed.
Absolutely. I feel like she's a really no-nonsense, Yorkshire, down-to-earth, no bollocks, take me as you find me type of is the sense I get, which I hadn't previously had. To the writing, Emily seemed not to particularly want to be heard or read, yet she wrote. What's going on there, then? It's a different thing, isn't it, to Charlotte?
I just think if people don't play the game, they're labelled as odd, aren't they? And this happened. We're talking about Kate Bush earlier. When I approached Kate Bush to write her tribute to Emily Brontë, everyone said, "Oh, she's a recluse. She's an eccentric. She's weird. Maybe she just doesn't like the media and doesn't want to be constantly, followed on Twitter and doesn't want to partake in that. That's most people actually. You know, this idea. So maybe if you flip it round and say, well, why are certain people obsessed with being in the media limelight? Maybe that's the odd bit, not. So I think we can flip it. I think, you know, if we're seeing, you know, maybe Charlotte was the odd one because she was so ambitious about her own writing. Maybe that's. So it's just whatever prism you're looking through, isn't it? You know?
Although, and part of my brain is now being a bit distracted because you just casually went, yeah, when I contacted Kate Bush, and I'm like, oh my God. And also, you, that little boy who taped Wuthering Heights. And you were that, well, you're not because you grew up at that point, but you're that little boy. And then you're there contacting Kate Bush and having an Emily Brontë stone. So just as a sidebar, what was that like for you?
Well, she's really hard to get hold of. I knew people who knew people, if you see what I mean. And none of them could help. Yeah. And I knew someone who knew Paddy, her brother, a musician, who played with him. And he said, look, there's no way, you know, it's just a wall. And then I knew someone who knew Flood, the producer, who'd produced Kate Bush and lots of other people. And he said the same thing, there's no way. Yeah, it just stops. And that really, the reason that happened is because she was stalked. And there was a guy attacked her with a sword, and you know, there was some really serious things. So she made a decision to put a wall around her. And it's a perfectly logical thing to do. There's nothing weird about that at all, I don't think. So the only way I could get hold of her, really, was through her agent, who's a guy called Murray Chalmers, who's a misnomer, because he's the least charming person I've ever dealt with. He was Morris's lover, he was in Morris's autobiography. So if you want to read about him, there's a very short description. So Murray Chalmers is a big agent, and he has lots of stars on his roster. And I emailed him and I wrote to him and I just got ignored. So in the end, I got his phone number and I rang him. And I've never had a phone call conversation like this before or since, yeah. And I imagine I do this, I don't know if it was a cordless phone, but I imagine it was because of the sound it made at the end, you know. And I rang this number and this is the way he answered. What do you want? And it completely threw me. I had lots of things prepared I was going to ask. And I went, and it just put me on the back foot. So it was quite disarming, you know, this technique. And I explained who I was, and he said, yeah, I'll pass something on. And anyway, he did. I didn't think he would do, but he did. And just by luck, it's not by luck, it's probably one of the reasons why Kate was interested in Emily Brontë. They share the same birthday. So they were both born on the 30th of July. It just so happened that year, 2018, it was the 200-year bicentenary birth of Emily Brontë, and it was the 60th birthday of Kate Bush. So the 30th of July was Kate Bush celebrating her 60th, and Emily's not celebrating. We were celebrating her 200-year bicentenary. It was also 40 years of Wuthering Heights, the single. And she hadn't done anything, really, to celebrate or acknowledge it, even. So I was kind of lucky in that sense that it just fell in. But what she said, which really wasn't helpful at all, is I'll write something, but if I don't like it, you can't use it. So that was the deal, basically, and we had to go with that deal. And it was only, I'm going to say, about a week before we launched the project that she would let us use this poem. And Pip Hall, who was the letter carver, so Pip Hall carved all the poems into stones. And the Emily poem is on the moors. It's halfway between Thornton and Haworth, and it's a big outcrop of rock called Ogden Kirk. And it's an undulating rock face. It's quite difficult to carve into. And it took Pip about a week to do it. So we literally had this window of a week. And we'd say, Kate, can we? And she did in the end say yes. And the most annoying thing about this story is she wrote a really lovely letter to me, and I've lost it.
No!
And I'm kicking myself. I know I moved house twice in the last few years, and it's somewhere. I think I can't imagine I've thrown it away, but I just don't know where it is. I think I might have put it in a book somewhere, but I've got thousands of books.
So someone in a second-hand shop somewhere will be like, what? What do I have?
Yeah.
Returning to the writing, though, so yes, it might not be odd that Emily didn't want attention, but she still did write an entire novel. What do you think, Claire, kind of moving on from the gondol writing, which was an important part of playing and growing up, why then?
It's kind of, well, it's a logical extension, and Wuthering Heights comes from Gondal. It has its origins in Gondal's imaginary kind of world. We know as early as kind of, I think it's 44, 45, they're kind of, there's again reference in a letter about they want to shop around 3 novels, but of course that then comes. I think it's part of their development as writers on one level, but the novel really gets published and is sent off because they try their hand at poetry, because in that day poetry was actually more prestigious, more likely to make money, but poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell was an absolute bomb. I mean, it sold 2 copies and Emily's voice was praised. So I think because that was such a commercial flop, they kind of, the working up of the novel into a form to send to a publisher was what had to happen. But I think she was, we don't have the complete work of Gondal, we only have fragments. But if you read the poems that form that saga, it's epic. It's written over years and years and years. It's like a big novel across a lot of time and space. So I think she's already working in a kind of long form. So I don't think it was hard for her to then develop it.
And I mean, the other thing as well is the expediency, because you've got Charlotte discovering Emily's poems, discovering them, depending on how you interpret that.
Sneaking into a room and breaking open the private
right
box, yeah.
And realising that she's a fantastic poet, and Charlotte's writing poetry, as is Anne, and Charlotte manages to persuade Emily to be published in this book, but only pseudonymously. And this is where the nom de plumes come from, That book was self-published, and it only sold 2 copies. Now, even if you just sold to your friends, you'd sell more than 2 copies, wouldn't you? So it was a very, very unsuccessful book. And Charlotte, being an ambitious one, she goes away and she writes The Professor, and Anne writes Agnes Grey. Emily writes Wuthering Heights. But it's Charlotte who really wants to be a novelist. She thinks, well, poetry doesn't pay. And they're worried about the financial situation because Branwell's not, succeeding, and the father's getting old, and they're actually in a nice house, but if he dies, they get kicked out. So they could be homeless, So she's thinking, really quite practically as well. Novels, it's still the same today, isn't it? Poetry doesn't sell, novels do. So I think there was that aspect as well, and they were writing together, perhaps competitively, as sisters often are. Those 2 books, Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights, get a publishing contract, and The Professor doesn't. And that must have really, really stung Charlotte. And she goes away and then writes Jane Eyre in a matter of months. And that, by some miracle, gets published before. So I think what Claire's saying, absolutely, yeah, the whole Gondal world and Angria and all those, that juvenilia feeds straight into it. But also Branwell was writing a novel, which we only have mentions in letters and so on. We've never actually seen any evidence of this, but apparently Branwell was writing a novel as well. So they were kind of all doing it, really.
So we knew that Kate was going to ask us to read a bit of material. I picked a piece I was going to talk about Emily being out on the moors and walking, being in nature anyway. And the section I was going to read ended with the poem Often Rebuked that you said you kind of fell in love with. But I'm not going to read Often Rebuked. So I'll get to the end of that section. I'm going to read another nature poem because it's gives a bit of variation. So I've got a chapter thinking about Emily and nature and her love of nature. And this is really about her relationship with the outside world. So as any northern inhabitant knows, the Yorkshire climate changes the landscape from season to season, transforming the locale from a cold, blustery space in winter to a beautiful purple and green idyll in summer. But no matter what the weather, though, Emily Brontë insisted on going outdoors. The moors seem to have beguiled her perpetually. In Wuthering Heights, they are often inhospitable, presenting a place of entrapment, especially for Mr. Lockwood, who at the beginning of the novel is stranded at the Heights precisely because of the wintry conditions outside. Elsewhere in the text, although it's mentioned briefly, the moors are a place of immense beauty and escape. Nellie reports that Cathy and Heathcliff would often sneak from the Heights as children to roam the moors, saying it was one of their chief amusements to run away to the moors in the morning and remain there all day. The image of Emily, energetically traversing the moors, remains equally popular. Locals often remembered her, whistling to her dogs and taking long strides over the rough earth. And parishioners in the church beside her home recalled viewing her through its windows, heading off over rugged terrain. Visitors today, of course, can walk in her footsteps, hiking across the Pennines to Penistone Crags, a place that Cathy draws attention to in Wuthering Heights, or to visit Top Withens, the ruins that are said to have inspired the titular property, so named in her novel, which is about 3.5 to 4 miles from the parsonage. On this route lies a secluded spot favoured by Emily and Anne that they dubbed the Meeting of the Waters. It's the water place, it's got a little bridge there. And the family friend Ellen Nussey described it as this: a small oasis of emerald green turf, broken here and there by small clear springs. A few large stones served as resting places. Seated here, we were hidden from the world, nothing appearing in view but miles and miles of heather, a glorious blue sky and brightening sun. A fresh breeze wafted on us its exhilarating influence. We laughed and made mirth of each other, and settled we would call ourselves the quartet. Emily, half reclining on a slab of stone, played like a young child with the tadpoles in the water, making them swim about, and then fell to moralising on the strong and the weak, the brave and the cowardly, as she chased them with her hand. It's this passion for walking in nature that gave Emily the solitude she often craved. As Charlotte described her, she was a solitude-loving raven. Her penchant for solitude and her infamous reserve were received awkwardly by some, making her unconventional in her day. But as Charlotte wrote, when Emily was on the moors, she felt free. She said, "My sister Emily loved the moors. Flowers brighter than the rose bloomed in the blackest of the heath for her. Out of a sullen hollow in a lived hillside, her mind could make an Eden. She found in the bleak solitude many and dear delighted, and not the least and best love was liberty." It's the image of a lone woman and her dog striding defiantly across the moorland that I found a particularly powerful one. Emily was an independent spirit in a time when female independence wasn't culturally welcomed, and it's partly for that reason that she's cruelly derided as odd and weird. So I would have then read you a section from Offer and Rebuke, but I'm going to, as it's talking about nature, I'm going to read you a poem that she wrote in December 1838, which is about this love of the outdoors. And as I started that section, I said, no matter what the weather, she was out all the time. So she writes a poem that doesn't actually have a title, but it's about the beauty of winter. And she wrote poems that are kind of about, winter, when is spring coming? But this is about the absolute beauty of this time of the year. And it's kind of, even though it doesn't have a title, it's often known by its first line, which is called "How still, how happy." How still, how happy. Those are words that would scarce agree together. I love the plashing of the surge, the change in heaven, the breezy weather, more than smooth seas and cloudless skies, and solemn, soothing, softened airs that in the forest woke no sighs, and from the green spray shook no tears. How still, how happy. Now I feel where silence dwells is sweeter far than laughing mirth's moist joyous swell, however pure its raptures are. Come, sit down on this sunny stone. 'Tis wintry light over flowerless moors, but sit, for here we are all alone, and clear expanded heaven's breathless shores. I could think in the withered grass spring's budding wreaths we might discern, the violet's eye might shyly flash and young leaves shoot amongst the fern. It is but thought. Full many a night the snow shall clothe those hills afar, and storm shall add a drearer blight, and wind shall wage a wilder war, before the lark may herald in fresh foliage twinned with blossoms fair, and summer days again begin their glory hallowed crown to wear. Yet my heart loves December's spile, as much as July's golden beam. Then let us sit and watch the while, the blue ice curdling on the stream.
So gorgeous, thank you. I'm having a weird, hearing all Emily's poems is making me want to cry every time. Weep things, very strange. Michael, can you exit?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to just comment on that, because I think that poem's really interesting. It's written while she's at Law Hill, about halfway in, to 6 months at Law Hill. And it's quite different to what she was writing before. It doesn't feel like a Gondel poem, does it?
No.
it feels like she's actually writing about herself.
Yeah, there's no evidence of Gondor in it at all.
No, so it's a break from that, and it's a happy poem.
But it's also one where she says, "Come and look at this view."
Yeah.
I mean, I could see spring's about to come, but let's just see the beauty of winter and sit and look at it with me. That's basically what it is.
And that's not solitude exactly. I'm going to suggest we end with your Hector and do audience questions now, if that's all right, Michael. So you'll round us off entirely.
I wanted to just rewind to the first part of the talk when you talk about Charlotte writing, obviously, the preface to Wuthering Heights. As someone who lost a sibling at quite a young age, if my brother had been a writer and he'd written a piece like Wuthering Heights, personally, I don't think Charlotte was in the right frame of mind when she wrote that. She was completely in grief. I know for a fact that if somebody had asked me to write a piece about my brother's work, because he also was a writer but didn't get published, I probably would have had the same reaction, to be honest. And my take on that now is, particularly with the intensity of how she loses all the siblings in such a short space of time. There's a letter in the parsonage that, if you read it, it's a letter to, I think it's Ellen Nussey, and her grief is just palpable. And I just personally think Charlotte gets a really bad rap for that piece, and there's a bit of me, as a person who has been in her position, I'd like to tear that up, because it's like, I know what she was going through. You just want to protect that person that you loved. And I feel like she gets a really bad rap for that. I think she's really misunderstood in a lot of ways because of that. And I think if Emily had seen the reaction to that, although, I know that they did loggerheads a bit, I think Emily would actually be a little bit disappointed that her sister's been attacked for that, because I kind of sometimes think, if it had been the other way around and it had been Charlotte that had died, what would Emily's reaction have been? The other thing that I wanted to just say, and Michael's aware of this, is I've been friends with the guys that have run Kate Bush's fan club for 40 years. And when Michael describes how Kate's agent spoke to him, that is exactly how he is, because I asked if Kate would do some work with a homeless charity that I'm involved with, and I got exactly the same response. In fact, he told me to F off. And I then went through my friends, because I kind of didn't want to, because they get so many requests. And I don't know if people are aware of this, but when Kate was releasing her debut record, the record company wanted a different song. Kate wanted Wuthering Heights, because she'd seen the film first, then she'd read the book, and she did quite a lot of research into Emily and realised, obviously, the connection with the birth date, and she wanted to put the song out there because she felt that she had a connection, and also because she knew that the story was really loved. And she said to EMI, if you don't release Wuthering Heights as a single, you're not releasing any of my music, full stop. And a lot of people don't know this. What she then did was, after the success of that, on her second album, on a song called Wow, which was a hit single, she actually says, Emily, at the start, it's really quiet. A lot of people don't realise this, but it was like her nod to Emily to say thank you, because you've now built my career. And a lot of people don't know this. Obviously, I've spent some time with her ex-partner, who's her producer. So, he's told me a lot of stuff. So I think the fact that she did the Stone, I wasn't actually that surprised.
Thank you so much. Thank you for adding to the discussion. I'm not going to ask Michael and Claire to respond, but thank you for sharing that, just because we've got quite limited time for audience questions. But really fascinating point. Thank you. So any audience questions? Hands raised. We've got there and there and there, and that'll probably be us.
How do you help young people connect with Emily? I've got my children here today.
I won't mention the school, but there's a high school which are having a literary festival this week, and they invited me to do 2 events. One was an introduction to the Brontes. And I was really excited about this. I thought, great, I'll go in there and I'll excite them and get them interested. And they've done a great job of this festival. They had a stage and they had a marquee and all these balloons and a merch table. really, really gone to town, and the room was packed full of, I think, 13, 14, 15-year-olds, yeah? Year 9, year 10, whatever that is, yeah? So I go in there with all this stuff, and I'm really excited, and they could not be less interested in the Brontes. And they were kind of sitting there going, oh, and one was just sort of sprawled on the table, oh, like that. And there's nothing I could say or do, you know, if I'd done a tap dance, there was nothing I could do. They were just sat there saying, you know, you are a middle-aged, boring idiot. We're not interested in anything. You're not on Xbox. Go away, basically. So I don't know what you do. I did a project with First Story on precisely that idea, and we planned to take some young people onto the moors to experience the landscape and get them interested that way. But then lockdown happened, and then the funding was time specific. So I've never actually done that, you know. So I think it's really hard. What do you think?
No, I think it is really hard. I mean, I think just, you know, I mean, I teach at university, so I kind of, you know, work with young people in this all the time, and it's about just cultivating, you know, reading materials with them rather than sending people off to kind of go and discover it yourself, and then talking about it. You know, what do you think? What did you like? What did you hate about it? And, you know, just even if people aren't interested or they find it difficult, working with that.
Hi, Claire. You mentioned earlier the piano.
Yes.
Have you heard the unthanks?
Yes.
Stuff that they put the poets to in. I just wondered what you thought about it.
Yeah. I mean, I really liked it. I find it hard to some of the, again, because I sit reading the poems a lot then, to hear them musically is kind of sometimes odd. But it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. And yeah, the piano is gorgeous. And I think it's actually really apt that the unthanks did that stuff to poetry, because again, one of the things we don't talk enough about Emily, and I mentioned it in passing, is her love of music. What a brilliant pianist. You know, she was the most talented. She could play so many classical pieces. There's some speculation on, you know, when she was in Brussels, there were particular concerts that she might have had access to. We can't say. But the fact that she, you know, she's the most talented. She's, you know, always in music as much as writing and learning languages. I think it kind of makes a kind of really fitting connection that they did that and put her own words then to that classical music.
I wonder if you could comment, please, on a relationship with Anne, which was so close. They wrote the Gondal together, and Anne, to me, was the one who understood her best.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that schism that happens. They're all writing these stories around Angria, and then, what is it, about 1830, so I can't remember what it is, but they break away, don't they? So Anne and Emily form their own world, Gondal, which is quite different, isn't it? It's run by women, you know, so it's really ahead of its time. When Anne is writing The Tent of Wildfell Hall, I think it's kind of a commentary on, well, probably both Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. You know, it's almost a kind of critique of the Gothic tradition in a way, isn't it? You know, so I think Anne, if she'd lived, would have gone on to write maybe more socially aware things. The last thing she wrote was a kind of dialogue, which was like wrestling with a religious conscience and things like that. So I think she was perhaps the most kind of social realist, if you like. Certainly, yeah. But I think Emily was really close to Bramwell as well, you know, because she was at home when Bramwell comes back from Thorpe Green, you know, and dwindles over 3 years and dies, you know. Charlotte's off, Anne's off. She's still at Thorpe Green, in fact. So Emily and Bramwell had a very close relationship as well, you know. So I think that, in terms of understanding Emily, I think those two things are important.
Thank you. No more questions, sorry, because we're just running out of time. As we know, we could go on forever. You could talk to both writers when you get their books. They will sign them now. But Michael, if you could just round off what's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your expertise and your passion with us. It's just been a brilliant setting for understanding Emily. Thank you.
Well, I thought I was going to read something from Walking the Invisible, but I thought actually, in tone, it's quite similar to what Claire has been reading. So I thought I'd actually read the opening of Ill Will, because it is a way of understanding Emily. It's certainly my way of understanding Emily was to write this book, you know. So I'm just going to read, a couple of pages, I think it is. Yeah. Heathcliff, in my book, the book starts with Heathcliff running off in the storm. If you know Wuthering Heights, he overhears Cathy say it would degrade her to marry him, and she doesn't know he's heard it. He runs off and is missing for 3 years, and when he returns, he's changed, he's wealthy, he's well-dressed, he's well-spoken, and he has a sadistic streak he didn't have when he left. So my book is what happens to him during that time. So this is the like 20 minutes after he's heard this, lost on the moors. You are walking through Butcher's Bog, along the path at Birch Brink, traipsing across Stanbury Moor to the Crowstones. Stunted firs and gaunt thorns, your only companions. Perhaps you will die out here, unloved and unhomed. There was a tale of old Tom, went out looking for a lost lamb, found a week on, icicles on his eyelids, half eaten by foxes. The ravens will eat out your eyes, and the crows will pick at your bones. The worms will turn you into loam. You've forgotten your name and your language. Mr. Earnshaw called you it when first he came across you. Mrs. Earnshaw called you brat when first she took you by the chuck. Starving when they took you in, they named you after their dead son. The man you called your father carried you over moor and fell. When finally you got to the gates of the farm, it was dark, and the man could hardly stand. He took you into the main room and plonked himself in a rocker. By the fire you stood, a ghost in their home. Next to you a living girl and a living boy who spat and kicked. This was their welcome to your new hovel. You'd spent weeks on the streets eating scraps from bin and midden, kipped by the docks and ligged in doorways. You trusted no one, loved no one, believing in nothing. I think I'll stop there, actually.
Perfect place to end, thank you. And a great setup for the next panel, actually, which is inspired by Emily at 12:30. Thank you both so much.
Thank you,
It's
everybody,
been
for turning
wonderful.
up.
Claire
Thank you.
O'Callaghan, Michael Stewart. Round of applause for both of them.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to everyone who attended our 2024 Bradford Literature Festival and helped to make it such a success. You'll be able to listen back to some of our selected events in the new series, coming soon.